Today's meeting is a seminar in the series of seminars we have in the research project Nation Building and Nationalism in Today's Russia. And we have now had 7 or something of these seminars, but this is the first time we had to turn people away because it was too great demand for seats in the auditorium. And the reasons for that clearly are 2. First is the topic. There's some really important and scary things going on in Ukraine these days, and to know more about what they are thinking in Kremlin, what are the strategies and the priorities in Ukraine is really something everybody wants to know more about. The second reason why so many people have showed up is, of course, today's speaker, Andreas Umland, which is one of the topmost international experts on both Russian nationalism and Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian affairs in general. So, Andreas is one of the participants in our research project. He's based in Kiev. He used to be with the Mohila Academy, but now he's at a senior research fellow at the Institute of Euro-Atlantic Cooperation in the same city. And today's the topic of his presentation will be Russia's agenda in Ukraine, ideological versus strategic determinants of the Kremlin's engagement in Crimea and the Donets Basin. Please, Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Paul and Helge, for inviting me. It's a big honor to be here. And the the talk will be a little bit perhaps unusual, both for the seminar and also for my own sort of biography, because indeed I have spent most of my research on Russian nationalism, on people like Zhirinovsky, Alexander Dugin. For 25 years I've done that, and this seminar is here now about Russian nationalism. But what I'm going to argue in a way is that Russian nationalism might not be the only factor explaining what we've been recently observing in Eastern Europe and in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and that there might be more trivial, more mundane things going on that have to do with greed, power, money, where there is a lot of ideological talk about the issues between Russia and Ukraine, but the deeper reasons I think have less to do with Russian nationalism than with these more trivial things. To start with, I think there is a paradox here to be explained. One could argue that this is all an old story. It's about Russian imperialism and territorial expansion, and there's been sort of a whole larger interpretation about the existence of the expansive Russian state that has always used expansion and territorial gains to solve internal problems. But I think this falls here a little bit, the conflict that we are now observing falls a little bit out of this general theme, because as one would think, what Russia is currently doing is against its national interests, because the main issues for Russia, I think they, to put it in a very simplified form, but I hope you will agree with me, they're going to be in foreign policy and internal politics. It's going to be the Islam and the confrontation with Islamic states, as well as Islam inside Russia. It's going to be China. China and Russia have the longest land border, and there are probably people here in the auditorium who know more about China than me, and modernization. And in all 3 of these issues, I think what Russia is currently doing, it's sort of shooting itself in the foot. The explanation that usually is given for that, why Russia is doing that, why Russia is sort of acting against its own Russian national interests, is that there is some radical ideology behind it. That you have ideologized people, fanatics, Eurasianists, Russian nationalists, pan-Slavists, imperialists, who have some sort of Manichaean world of the view, and they're trying to sort of implement their ideologies, and then this all gets into conflict with Russian national interest. To a certain extent, that explanation, I think, is true, but I think altogether, my interpretation of why the current Russian leadership is behaving the way it is behaving would not focus so much on nationalist ideologies that do play a big role in Russian public affairs these days, but they are, I think, not driving what the Kremlin is currently doing. And the story here is a rather simple and for us maybe even boring story, for West Europeans boring story. It's all about European integration, about good governance, about how to create sustainable deep democracy, and the sort of approaching of European values, if you want to call it, to the East, and the threats that these European values, rather than NATO, is posing to the current Russian political system. In a way, that's a very boring story. We know all this literature about Europeanization and the transposition of the acquis communautaire outside the European Union and all that, but I think that's actually what is the core of the story. And so I will talk about three topics here, and I'm aware that I'm not covering everything that could be covered here. I need to talk a little bit, which I thought I would not have to talk. Is actually Russia deeply involved in what's currently going on in eastern Ukraine? I thought that's an issue that's more or less clear, but there have been now some papers and conference proposals coming out that just came out in the last 2-3 weeks after I've submitted my abstract for this presentation, where serious scholars in North America, Serhiy Kudelia, Ivan Kachanovsky, Lukan Wei, and others are proposing to actually interpret the Eastern Ukrainian conflict as a civil war, or something like a civil war. I think one has to deal first with this issue and actually sort of before one talks about the Russian involvement there, actually argue that there is a Russian involvement. Then the second issue is ideologies like Eurasianism, the Russian world, and so on. I won't talk too much about them because, as far as I understood, you've talked here a lot already about these different Russian nationalist ideologies. As I mentioned already, I will rather argue against them and against their role in this whole conflict. And then I want to talk a little bit about the sort of confrontation the deeper confrontation that is going on, I think, here about post-Soviet transition, the Europeanization issue that I mentioned already, and the role of the association agreement and all of that. So first, is there actually, this current war in eastern Ukraine something that is, where Russia is basically behind it? That's so far difficult to argue because the information is all very fresh, and my impression, and I think many observers' impression, is that there is a sort of a theater of a civil war, and that we have local actors and we have sort of the appearance of a civil war, but that there is actually an agenda behind. If you like, there is a conspiracy going on, and the conspiracy, to put it bluntly, is organized from Moscow. And so far, this cannot be easily argued because it is a conspiracy, and the thing are clandestine. And until today, the Russian leadership is even denying that Russia has become involved in late August, even that which is now documented in many correspondence reports and with videos and with interviews and so on. The involvement of Russia from late August on with regular troops, I think, is beyond any question. But there's now still a discussion going on with a number of scholars in North America who are clearly not paid by Russia or something like that, who want to argue that there is a civil war, that the whole thing sort of at least started as a civil war. I don't think that's plausible, and we will have to see what more information is coming out about the start of the armed conflict in Eastern Europe. I think it's implausible to argue that this is just a civil war, that Russia is sort of has only become involved later on. And the reason is very simple. That's not the first case we're observing. We have other similar cases before: Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. So the current scenario that is being implemented is nothing new, and we know that Russia has been involved in what's going on in Transnistria, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. So the suggestion that comes up by itself is sort of that this is a continuation of this policy. At the same time, we have, of course, Crimea, and with Crimea, I think it's, Putin has admitted that Russian troops have participated in the whole operation, and even in that case, where there was considerably more support for secession and even annexation to Russia in Crimea, Russia felt it necessary to get involved, heavily involved, with the so-called green men, the friendly people, these soldiers without insignia that were standing behind the local separatists. And the third reason why I think it is more plausible to argue now already, when the empirical side is not yet entirely clear, where we don't have yet all the evidence, all the sort of empirical proof that there is indeed a clandestine operation going on here, is that there is no politics of the civil war. So if you look at the leaders of the insurrection in the Donbass and the Donets Basin, if you look on the organizations involved, if you consider the resources they have, there's no story there. I would agree with people like Kudelia and Kukanway and Ivan Kachanovsky that there was a genuine separatist movement, a significant separatist movement, if a part of the Party of Regions would have had a congress where local notabilities, where central politicians in Kiev from the Donbass would have said, no, we don't want to be part of Ukraine anymore. And if then parts of the Ukrainian army would have gone over to this Party of Regions separatist congress or section or whatever, but there is no such story to tell. The odd thing about the leaders of the current insurrection in the Donbass is not only that we don't know them, that these are largely people unknown to us, but also Ukrainians don't know them, and until recently, people in the Donbass didn't know them. These are, as one would say in Russian, случайные люди. These are accidental people with no local constituency, with no known political biography, who came out of nothing, or came from Russia simply, like people like Igor Girkin, alias Strelkov, or Alexander Borodai, a whole number of other people in very important positions in these so-called People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. They come from Russia, but also there are local people. But the point is that these local people were nobodies until recently, unknown also to the people in the Donets Basin, and that points to me to an argument that would see that not as a civil war, as a genuine insurrection in the region, because we don't have really a politics of this insurrection with political leadership, political resources, political organization, political forums. There are none of them. Or the organizations, the Russian bloc, or there was even an organization called the Donetsk People's Republic before, that were so small and so insignificant, also locally in the Donetsk Basin, not just in Ukraine as a whole, but also in the Donetsk Basin, that there's no story to tell. And if there's not this story, there has to be another story. And I think the story that we're going to find out at the end is going to be one of deep Russian involvement. And we of course, we still are waiting for all the empirical evidence for that, or at least I'm waiting. So I think that has to be clarified in advance. For some of you, this is all very obvious. Perhaps I've told you maybe what has been clear already to you before. But there is now in the West, as I said, in North America, there is a discussion emerging around that. I'm going to go tomorrow to Ottawa to a large conference in Ukrainian studies, where some of these people who have been making the civil war argument are going to be. And I want to find out why are they making this argument. I mean, what's the purpose of it? What's the the academic groundings, but what's also the, I don't know, what's the usefulness of such an argument? I think that's as it looks now, of course, it just a sort of an argument that would actually support Russian propaganda, because it would say, well, there's a genuine civil war, and then the Ukrainian army came, and then Russia came to help their people. That would be the, but it doesn't really all get, it doesn't really become a whole picture, a full picture, if you think of it in these terms, because there should have been, as I said, a politics of the uprising. About now the second issue about ideologies and Russian nationalism as an explanation for what is going on in between Russia and Ukraine. Now, I think the predominant interpretation, at least as I've perceived it in the Western press, has been over the last month to paint more and more Russia as a sort of revisionist, a large power driven by some sort of Russian nationalist ideology. And my second PhD topic, Alexander Dugin, has now suddenly become of interest to many journalists who write about him, and he is indeed a very scary figure. Perhaps you have talked already about him here in the seminar. There is a Russian ultra-nationalist, I would say fascist, philosopher or pseudo-philosopher who is the main exponent of what's called neo-Eurasianism, basically an anti-American ideology that is trying to paint the picture as of world history as a fight between land powers and sea powers, and the US would be the heading this alliance of sea powers, which is a civilization that is in contradiction with the civilization of land powers, the thalassocracies, whereas the tellurocracies. And if you know a little bit about geopolitics and the German conservative revolution and so on, you may know all these arguments. And so there is this whole story of this conflict that basically what is playing out in Ukraine today is sort of a large civilizational conflict between these sea powers, the liberal sea powers on the one hand, and the illiberal or anti-liberal land powers on the other. And Dugin is a particularly extreme exponent of this, but Putin is sort of implementing this policy. I don't think it really, for me, this story doesn't really fly, because what Russia is currently doing would actually be in many ways in contradiction to Eurasianism, or to what one would think Eurasianism would prescribe. And Eurasianism would prescribe that Russia is trying to sort of build alliances with land powers, with Asian land powers, with European land powers, and that it would perhaps rather try to build relations towards the European Union, and to sort of drive try to promote division between the European Union and the US, and then sort of have this Eurasianist vision of the Euro-Asian countries forming an alliance together against the sea powers, the US and perhaps Great Britain. This would be a policy that should follow Eurasianism. But actually what Russia is now doing is exactly undermining this sort of policy towards in closer cooperation with Europe. The same goes, I think, for Asian countries, for instance, the relationship between Russia and Kazakhstan, because what Russia is now doing in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, that it's promoting an ethnocentric argument, an argument about kin and blood and kinship and solidarity between Russians, or that is creating in Kazakhstan, and perhaps there are people here who know more about Kazakhstan than me. I know that only from the press, that is creating insecurity or doubts in Kazakhstan about this, about the Eurasian Union, the customs union, about the issue of an alliance between Kazakhstan and Russia, because Kazakhstan, as most of you will certainly know, has a rather large Russian minority that, like in eastern Ukraine, is geographically concentrated, and that is sort of on the border towards Russia, and where you could easily imagine what's currently happening in the Donets busing being repeated in a few years in northern Kazakhstan, with similar arguments about saving Russians in Kazakhstan from Kazakhstanization, or however you want to call that. The other big ideology that is sometimes mentioned here is in this connection is a sort of recent modification, if you want to see it that way, of Pan-Slavism, the idea of a Russian world, Russkii mir, that Russia is sort of is trying to create a larger circle of people either friendly towards Russia or interested in Russian culture and Russian language and promoting Russian language and culture and so on, to get influence outside Russia via this sort of larger Russian world. I think that is also sort of not a story that is supported by what is Russia doing now, because if you look, for instance, on the opinion polls in Ukraine, Russia is actually now destroying the Russian world. You have now in many in most parts of eastern and southern Ukraine growing anti-Russianism, and you have a rather strange formation of a Ukrainian political nation now on the basis of anti-Putinism, if you like it. So there are lots of issues that still divide Eastern and Western Ukrainians, but what most of them now agree on is that Putin and the current Kremlin leadership is an enemy of the Ukrainian state, to which these Russian speakers and even ethnic Russians feel attached to. So this is also something that that is not sort of, that doesn't make sense if you take these ideologies seriously. I don't think that is something that you should expect. And the whole, especially I think for my impressions so far is, and it's going to be interesting to research. I think what Russia is now doing, this vilification and demonization of the Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian people, by using the fascism comparison, the comparison with the Wehrmacht, with the SS, and so on. I think that's something that many Ukrainians, even Russophile, or until recently, Russophile Ukrainians find unacceptable, and that is creating a divide in the Russian world, is actually destroying the Russian world in the most important country, arguably, of the Russian world. And so that's why I'm doubtful that these ideologies, and one could imagine other ideologies which would probably be variations either of Eurasianism or this Russian ethnocentric ideology that could be mentioned here. I doubt that these ideologies are really driving what the Russian state is currently doing. The Russian state is certainly promoting these ideologies. They are now dominating the Russian public sphere, and they are having an effect on Russian public opinion. What we've been observing recently is not only a further rise of anti-Americanism, but also in connection with the conflict of anti-Europeanism or anti-EUism, if you want to call it that way, that is an increasing estrangement of the Russian people from the European Union, which until recently had a rather positive image in Russia. So NATO and the US were always seen as something threatening, but the European Union and the major states of the European Union were seen as largely were seen in friendly terms and as not threatening, and it looked until recently as if the European Union was not a threat to Russia. And I think that's also now I'm coming to the third topic, what is actually happening here, and that is to a certain degree a surprise to me that the current leadership would be so aggressively reacting to the association agreement, to the European integration of former Soviet states. the story that is going on here, I think, is not about Russian nationalism and or imperialism and expansion and revanche, but it's actually a threat that is emanating for the current Russian political socio-economic system from the expansion of EU values into the former Soviet realm and especially into Ukraine as a country that is close to culturally close, still remains culturally close to the Russians, and where the implementation of a successful Europeanization program would have repercussions inside Russia. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, what we are observing here is basically a story about money, about power, about greed, and about trying to preserve a system where the power holders can enrich themselves. And the trivial story that I think is happening here now is that the European Union, with its association agreements, is trying to provide an alternative social model to the post-Soviet systems that have emerged in the former Soviet Union, and that these systems pose a fundamental threat to the logic of the Putin system and other similar systems in the post-Soviet area. And I think the reason that this has come out so suddenly as the main issue, as I see it here, is that until recently, until a year ago, I would say, or maybe until 1.5 years ago, Russia did not take that seriously. So the association agreements and the main issue here is, of course, the EU-Ukraine association agreement, not so much the association agreements with Moldova and with Georgia. Until 1.5 years ago, I think Russia did not believe that the association agreement would be signed and ratified, and that it would be something important, and that's why also the image of the EU was something that remained until, I would say, about 2 years ago, largely untainted. There was a slight, so to say, conflict in connection with the Russian-Georgian war. When you look at the Russian opinion polling data, the opinion about the EU goes down for a few weeks, but then comes up again. And the EU again stands after the Russian-Georgian war as a rather positive organization for most Russians. But what happened then about 2 years ago, that it becomes clear that the association agreement has a serious chance to be signed and ratified by whomever, even by Yanukovych, and B, that the association agreement is actually something real, that it's not just that is actually not an association agreement. I think that was a little bit the misunderstanding that has happened here. So the EU has association agreements with many countries of the world, but in fact, the association agreements that it has now signed with Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova go further than most of these other association agreements. They even go further than the Europe agreements that the EU signed in the early 90s with the Central European countries, where it was already clear that these countries would probably get the membership perspective and probably would become members one day. And these association agreements now signed with Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova even go about the association and stabilization countries with the treaties with the Western Balkan countries, where it was already clear where it's clear since around 2000 that these countries will become members of the European Union, and where it's clear that these association agreements with these countries are preparations for membership. And the paradox now is that while there is no membership perspective in the association agreements with Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, these treaties are larger than those earlier treaties signed with the Central European states and the Western Balkan states, where association agreements were basically signed with the idea in mind that these countries would become members of the European Union, and these treaties would be preparing these countries for the membership. And then in early January, I think of 2013, the text of the association agreement was leaked. I don't know whether this was and then appeared as a PDF in the Ukrainian internet. I don't know whether this was the moment, or so to say, but at a certain point, it became, I think, clear to the Russian leadership that this is something big, and this is for real. This is actually going to be something that is that is going to have an impact on these countries, and that is, as some people even say, anything but membership. So if these association agreements are signed, fully ratified, they are not yet fully ratified. They are only ratified so far between the European Parliament and the Ukrainian Parliament, but not yet by the EU member states. But if all 28 EU member states ratify these association agreements, the EU will become a participant of domestic politics in these countries. There will be association councils, an association committee, and the EU will actually, although these countries will not yet be members of the EU will actually have its foot in these countries, and these will, and one could then expect indeed Europeanization, indeed implementation of the acquis communautaire. And I think this is the main story going on here, that suddenly the European Union has appeared as a threat to the logic of the Russian political system, that there's an alternative model emerging here that questions the vertical of power, that questions the whole logic of this personality cult, the oligarchic system. All these things are now threatened by these association agreements, and at the end, I mean, the EU is still sort of has this rather strange language. If you follow the discourse of the EU on the possible future membership of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, then the formulations are rather strange. But I think it's clear to me, if these association agreements become fully ratified and then implemented, to a large degree implemented, the question of membership will come itself, because these countries will already be, in many ways, de facto members of the European Union, or at least of the European larger space of economic ties and legal regulation. And this is then something that would really pose a threat, and that would provide an alternative model. And here again, you could argue then identity and nationalism and national issues come in again, because the ties, especially between Ukraine and Russia, are close. And if Europeanization is successful in Ukraine, then this would automatically become a model also for many Russians. They would look at it and they would say, well, if Malorussia, if the little Russians can do that, why can we, the great Russians, not do that? That's the language that is sometimes used here for the Ukrainians as the little Russians, and the Russians in Russia as the great Russians. So I think this is not about NATO. There is a large discourse now, also not only from Russia coming, but also from many Western observers who argue here about NATO and US and the threat it poses to Russia. My interpretation is that the Russian leadership knows exactly the difference between Russia and Serbia, and that Serbia didn't have an overkill capacity and Russia does have it, and that therefore there is no real threat from NATO to Russia. I think that's what they very well understand. They know that Russia is not Iraq and Serbia and Syria and so on. So that's also why Russia is playing all these games in the Baltic countries and because they know that the stakes would be so high of a confrontation between NATO and Russia that there would be always some countries in NATO who would say, no, we don't want to do that. Yeah, it's, who cares about the Baltic country? Even some would even say, who cares about the Baltic countries? We want to get into World War III here. So I think that Russia is playing on that, and unfortunately, some Western observers are supporting this game, this sort of this threatening game about NATO. I think it's not about NATO. It's about the EU, and it's about this rather boring issue of Europeanization and EU rules and acquis communautaire and all these thick documents with all the regulations about how yogurt should be made and all these things. I mean, yeah, it sounds bizarre, but this is exactly this sort of the whole package as a whole is then a threat to Russia. I think that's what's going on, and that actually explains the aggressiveness of Russia. I think that's I think that, or of the Kremlin, if you like, it's not actually about Russia and Ukraine. It's about a small circle of people who have power, who don't think actually. I think in terms of national interest, to come back to what I started with, because what Russia is now doing is if you are a Russian patriot, you should be very critical of what the Kremlin is now doing. It's about preserving power, and it's about trying to prevent the consolidation of the Ukrainian state. I also think that it's not with Crimea. I think it is about territory, because there is this whole metaphysics about Crimea, that it is something that Russians are by blood and by history, and so specifically attached to it. And there's all this Krimnash. But with the Donbas, I think that's not any longer about territory. The Donbas, I think, in my interpretation, is Russia's instrument to spoil Ukrainian Europeanization, to spoil reforms, to distract the leadership from domestic reforms, from fighting against corruption. It's an instrument to reshape internal Russian discourse, internal Ukrainian discourse, to refocus the leadership and to prevent the implementation of the association agreement. That's I think the biggest threat that is now has now emerged for the current leadership. Maybe not in the short run. I think in the short run, Ukraine obviously will have a very bumpy road, and even without Russian mingling, I think the implementation of the association agreement for the next 3, 4, 5 years would be problematic, but because all the standards have to be adapted and so on. But once that is done, once this adaptation period is over, and then actually Ukraine is able to export on a large scale to the European Union and have sort of standards implemented that then would also make Ukrainian exports in other regions of the world much more attractive, because these countries would know that these are actually EU standards that are already being observed in Ukraine. And then you have this alternative in 5, 6, 7 years, alternative socio-economic model emerging, which would then question, as I said, the Russian political system. That is then all connected as well to the stagnation and maybe even now recession of the economy of Russia, to the rise of a small but vocal protest movement and the protests of 2011, 2012. I think many people have focused on the protests and the connection between the protests and then the reconfiguration of Russian domestic discourse through the Crimea annexation and involvement in eastern Ukraine, and the split in the protest movement that this has caused. There are now, the protesters are now divided, basically, how they especially how they assess the Crimea annexation. I think that does play a role, but there is a larger story going on here about the sustainability of the system without rising oil prices, or even now with falling oil prices. I think there is this somewhat larger story here, and Russia is sort of under pressure here now on both fronts. That on the one hand, the system that Putin has created is not working by itself anymore. By itself, it's sort of the oil price is not rising anymore. The people are questioning the sustainability of the protests. The Moscow intelligentsia is having its doubts, and on the other hand, this emerging counter model that until a few years ago looked like not very serious, but has now become actually something that might actually work, and that then could be a threat to the Kremlin system. Maybe I finish on that and rather answer to your questions.
Thanks a lot, Andreas, for provocative and insightful presentation. Am I on? Yeah, good. So, yeah, I think it's good that you did not use more time, since I think there are very many questions in the audience. Just a first quick remark from myself. You said that since this agreement between Ukraine and the EU is so comprehensive, it amounts almost to de facto membership. And if you have de facto membership, you will eventually become the Euro member. Well, Norway has been a de facto member in 20 years, and we will never become a Euro member.
But we want you to become a member.
Okay, good. So, Julie, Willem, please introduce yourself. Julie first, and then Heidi.
Thank you. Julie Wilhelmsen, I work at NUPI. Thank you very much for your talk. I was thinking about this need we have to paint one story, which we have to do as political scientists, I suppose, but sometimes how dangerous it is that we have to paint one story. So I was just thinking about your three points. On the first one, is there a civil war in Ukraine or not? Sometimes I'm afraid that we're so preoccupied by not being part of Russian propaganda, and I am myself, that we fall for the temptation to create too simple a story of what the Ukraine conflict is about, instead of actually acknowledging, yes, maybe part of it actually is a civil war, and we should talk about that, because we don't want propaganda here, as we have in Russia. And then secondly, on the on the kind of dismissal of the ideological side of it, we had this week in Oslo a visit by Alexeyevich Svetlana, who's, as you know, a well-known author, and really one of her main messages was to highlight how Putin's new talk on the big Russia, and maybe an ethnic Russian big power, how really he is just the materialization of what she picks up when she does her hundreds of interviews in Russia. So the craving for the big idea and the willingness of the Russians to go along with that, and seeing policies in Ukraine on that background. So I'm not so sure. She would at least have challenged your dictum that this is really about a small circle on the top in Russia.
Okay.
Yes, that was. So your response to that would interest me. Should we dare to use many explanations this time?
Yeah. So I think we take responses for each question at the time, please.
Yeah, about the Civil War, I've written about that myself, and if you read, for instance, there was this article by Serhiy Kudelia, who is a Western Ukrainian, who hasn't used the word civil war, but who has made an argument that the roots of the insurgency are local, and I buy many of his arguments. You know, you have sociological polls that point that there are grievances in the Donbas. I also buy his argument about the weakness of the Ukrainian state. So there is a whole theoretical argument about the Ukrainian state. But although he points to the structural things, you know, there is no story. I mean, where did the Civil War come from? Who prepared it? Where do the weapons come from? Who are the generals? Who are the politicians? Where is the mobilization? There's no story of that. There are a few thousand people.
And that's good.
Yeah.
Should we try to
Yeah.
and just
Okay.
take off the first one? I don't think you...
Also, if you yeah. Well, if you buy the structural argument about the weakness of the Ukrainian state, the alienation of the people on the Donbas from the paradox is that we did not have anything similar appearing there before. There should have been some skirmishes. There should have been a little bit happening before, but there was even in Crimea there was an entirely peaceful development for more than 20 years. And now you have suddenly these heavily armed people coming out of nothing, partly coming simply out of Russia, and then this is a civil war. I mean, it doesn't make sense. Why did the civil war not happen? Let's say in late 2010, when Ukraine was in late 2009. Sorry, 2009. when Ukraine was heavily hit by the world financial crisis, had a larger fall in the GDP and industrial production than it has now, and when Yushchenko was becoming ultra-nationalist, you know, and that was culminating then with making Bandera between the 2 rounds of the 2010 presidential elections a national hero, you know. It should have happened then, I think. You know, that would have been the moment. The threat perception should have been there already. The structural deficiencies of the Ukrainian states were there already. The economic crisis was deep, but nothing happened. You know, it should have. Why did it not happen? And I think that just points to the fact that while there are structural deficiencies that that were there for many years, for 20 years, you could argue, there was always this potential for you know, in Crimea. If you look, especially Crimea, if you look on the opinion polls, there was always about half of the population that actually wanted to go to Russia. You know, so, but then there's the other half that, you know, that don't, or they want to just increased autonomy, especially the Crimean Tatars. Were, you know, they very much prefer to be in and then it. I think, I mean, the problem here is indeed empirical evidence. My argument against a little bit about against Kudelia was that this might not be actually about classical political science research. It might be more sort of criminological research, where you have to actually look and who met whom, where the money flew, you know, where the people came, what the biographies of these minor peoples are, who have no political biographies. These are, I mean, who is this Alexander Zakharchenko, or this Ponomaryov in Slavyansk, who was the mayor, the self-declared, or this Gubarev from, I mean, these are bizarre people, farcical people who suddenly appear out of nothing and then call themselves prime ministers and people's governors and whatnot, and there's no story of a civil war here. You know, the civil war should have some politics involved, and I don't see
the other.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, I'll just, you know, I'm trying. Yeah. Okay. So the ideological side, yes. I mean, you know, I've studied that thing 25 years, and I think I know that, I've met Zhirinovsky and many others and so on, but it's and again it has to be something, a story to be told yet, because it's a new story. It's something that in this sort of aggressiveness has not been there for a year ago. I mean, a year ago Russia was different from today. We have a new Russia now. That's, you know, that's something, and the suddenness of this appearing actually points to me that there is, you know, this is something artificial, that this is not something that actually goes as deep as you would think. And you know, I also see the opinion polls and the large support for the Crimea annexation, but I could imagine that this will switch again in a few years when it, you know, all the problems attached to it. The economic problems, the international standing, the image of Russia in the world, when this all becomes a sort of issue, when the World Championship in 2018 will probably not take place, I cannot imagine that taking place in 2018. When all these things will come up, with, you know, then I think there will be a rethinking, and then I think the ideological side will and then people will ask, why did we do that? You know, what's in for Russia? You know, in all of these adventures, we could go until 2014. We could also go to Crimea and have our holidays there. The only difference in practical terms for Russians coming to Crimea today is that they don't have to exchange their rubles for hryvnias anymore. Anything else they could have done before annexation on Crimea. I think it's something that is driven more by manipulation of public opinion than by sort of deeper issues here.
If I may challenge you to summarize your views in 2 words, literally 2 words. Are you saying that power politics in Kremlin is the only cause or the main cause? 2 words.
Like with the civil war issue, it's not. I think Russia is the main cause of the armed uprising in the Donbass, as it as with Crimea and with Abkhazia and so on. But it's not the only one. Of course, you need the local sort of. I mean, you have to play with something to play with, and the same with the ideologicals. Okay. Of course, all these things. You could go back to Slavophilism, to the Third Rome, and all these things. They've been there already for decades and centuries, maybe. Okay. And the Kremlin is playing with that. But okay. I don't think it's really the driving.
Yeah, good, very good. Heidi Kjærne, next question.
Thank you for a great talk. I wonder, given that you are saying that there's a whole economic story driving things, what do you think about the policy responses from the EU, the sanctions and so on? Is that going to work, do you think? And what other options are there? You were talking about the whole criminological research that is needed to understand the things that are going on in Russia. Are the sanctions targeted correctly in your view? And what other options are there to the sanctions? For example, thinking about the EU association agreements as one option for the Ukraine. And then seeing the Eurasian Union as another option or closer association with Russia. But do these two options have to be, do they have to exclude one another? Do they have to be exclusive? Would it be possible for the EU to see EU association agreements for Ukraine as something that could happen alongside with a closer association also with Russia?
It's a complicated issue, and I have to say I'm rather a comparative politics person than an IR person. From my sort of rather sort of non-theoretically informed opinion, what has happened here is that there were lost chances. For instance, when in 1999 Russia agreed at the OSCE summit in Istanbul to withdraw its troops from Transnistria until 2002. There should have been some, and it did not do that. Yeah? There should have been some sanctions then already, which would have sent a signal to Russia then that you cannot do that simply. And what has happened was that actually the opposite happened. In 2001, when it was already clear that Russia wouldn't withdraw the troops till 2002, Putin was invited to the Bundestag and gave a speech there in German language, standing ovations and so on. And the message to Russia then was that basically you can do what you want in the former Soviet. You sign an agreement to withdraw troops, you don't do it, and we do some strategic partnership with you. That's our response to it. These sort of diplomatic things, they've been tried already. The same thing after 2000, after the Sarkozy plan of 2008, where you can argue a lot about the who came when. Was Saakashvili? Did Putin? The Georgians are saying the Russian troops were already marching towards Georgia when Tskhinvali was attacked. You can argue about that. But then there was the Sarkozy plan, which was signed by Russia and Georgia, which foresaw the withdrawal of troops from South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And by the way, there was no war in Abkhazia. Yeah, that was a sort of side thing that Russia simply took over, and which was of course much more valuable than South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And then Russia didn't withdraw the troops. And then Germany announces the modernization partnership with Russia, and so these sort of diplomatic things they've been tried, and they've given the Russians the impression that there will be some sort of all these talk about international law and sovereignty of states and so on. But at the end of the day, the EU would always they would not just not impose sanctions, but they would actually do rather a step in the direction of Russia, like inviting Putin to the Bundestag or proposing modernization partnership. And then I think now there is it's too late, because Crimea is annexed, and the annexation of Crimea is unacceptable. And I don't see this. You know, how are you going to? Now it's too late. You should have sent the signals earlier. Then I think the annexation of Crimea would not have happened. And then you could imagine maybe something like an association agreement between the EU and Russia. Yeah. So that would have been, until half a year ago, that would have been still sort of, you could work. There were these four spaces and all. There was all these efforts by the EU, but the EU did not send early enough clear signals to Russia that international law is actually something that has to be observed. And then they got the impression that, you know, international law is fine, but not in our area. And now it's too late, and you cannot. But I mean, and then you have the Budapest Agreement, all this non-proliferation regime. You have all these large world political issues suddenly in there. It's now too late. I think and then sanctions are the only. What else? No military option, no diplomacy anymore. What remains are sanctions. And well, I mean, you know, the big thing is still oil. I think. I mean, there's a lot of discussion, I think, a distracting discussion in the EU about Russian gas. But if you look on the Russian budget, gas is actually not that important. What is much more important is oil. And with oil, I'm not as, maybe there are experts here who understand these issues better. But as far as I know, the EU could probably replace Russian oil. And then Russia would perhaps have a problem transporting its oil to other potential buyers. I'm not that much of an expert on that, but that is something where and I don't understand why the EU is not doing it, because I mean, there have been even arguments about whether the oil price would actually rise because then other countries would, you know, and then now the oil prices. So there's still a lot of potential to pressure Russia, which is not used, and I think that could hit probably Russia. Even in the short term, hard. I don't know what the legal basis for this could be. I mean, after Crimea and all these things, you know, why should one observe, you know, agreements with Russia? But if you, apart from the legal side, my impression is that there is a lot of unused pressure potential that the EU, for some reason, is not using. With gas, it's complicated, because Russian gas cannot be easily replaced. You know, Lithuania just got its LNG terminal and so on. But this is probably will be years, maybe will never be fully replaced. But with oil,
I have 5 more people on my list to start with. So if you can move on. You there? I don't in the blue. Yeah, please.
No. Thank you. My name is Rolf Berg, background, so to speak, in the Minister of Foreign Affairs, now retired. It was extremely powerful, interesting lecture we gave. I congratulated on that. Very rich agenda indeed. I'm an historian, so I just have one historical parallel before I go to my question, and that is the historical parallel still is not very much 1945. The Great War had ended, a new situation, and Russia sees, with reason or not, the West as a new adversary, enemy. Also from an ideological, it's a threat to the Stalin system. And now, I think what you said about the European Union now being seen as a threat to the Putin or the Russian system is a little bit like that. I'm not talking about necessarily a Cold War, but there's a parallel. Now my question would be, if I were a Russian now, walking more or less in this very sad valley of something which, of course, points in the way of disaster. But Russian prestige is falling in Eastern Europe, all over the world, and they, as you say, managed to really front the Ukrainians. Now, we talked about signals. Now, what about signals of the market? Look at the Russian economy. Is a disaster, heading for disaster. Currency reserves are falling and investments are falling. Will Putin get the money to finance his big army, navy, defense reform? Are these indications that now perhaps the Russians will change the course a little bit? They can stay with they can still have the Crimea, the parts of influence in East Korea. Maybe it's now time to think a little bit. Or do they not necessarily occupy themselves with these kind of questions? Maybe they do not see their economy as bad as we see it in the West. Is our interpretation, our reading of the Russian economy so bad, or do the Russians have a slightly different picture of their own economy? Thank you.
Yeah, concerning 1945, my argument was in a way that we are not in the age of extremes anymore. This is not something about big ideologies and fanatics and Bolshevism and fascism and all these things. This is more about, you know, people who have power and property and you know, the private jets and all these things. They're trying to preserve that, and then they manipulating with all of these things, which are there, and there is something to manipulate with. I mean, there, you know, you can have all these. There's a rich sort of culture of Manichaeanism and sort of anti-Westernism in Russia, which you can play with. But I think in 1945 that was still the, you know, that was, you know, about ideology, that was about systems, and that was about worldviews. That's not any longer the case. You know, there's this bizarre thing that these leaders who are so anti-Western, most of their children live in the West here somewhere, study here, and they do have their villas here and come for holidays and so on. So I think that's the difference. That's what I'm trying to say, so to say, that we are in a different world here now, and it's more about these much more trivial, mundane things that are happening there. About the and that also ties up with the economic question. One interpretation of what has been happening now in Russia's policies towards Ukraine, that the Russian leadership saw the stagnation coming, or maybe even the recession of the economy, Russian economy coming, and that they wanted to create an explanation for that. You know, that would be a scenario sort of interesting to explore. So they knew already, oh, that system is not working anymore. But what do we give the Russian public now that the system is not working? And well, we give it Crimea. So, you know, the economy is not doing well, but Krymnash. Yeah? So that's a sort of a compensation for that. So in a way, then the sanctions would also not have much of an effect, because it would actually support the story that it's not that the Putin system is wrong, but it's because we are now helping our brothers in eastern Ukraine, and we're spending money on that, and we're having sanctions, and we are under pressure. That's why the economy is not. But I think I would still argue for sanctions, because I would suspect that there are many people in Moscow who know exactly this story, who understand this story, and who know that when their salaries are not rising anymore, or even are cut, or even when they cannot travel anymore, or when they have all sorts of problems in their private lives suddenly, that this is not something that was bound to happen, but this is something tied to the system and to this confrontation, and they will. The hope for these sanctions for me is that there will be emerging a group in Moscow that will actually say, no, we are not paying the price for, you know, this is too much, you know, this is, and you know, we have 1/6 of the landmass of the world, and for Russia it's not the highest priority to get more lands. You know, we want to have a nice life. You know, we want, you know, my children wants to study in Great Britain, or maybe here in Oslo, and that's important for me, and then maybe there could be some group that then would. But that's very difficult to say. All that, I mean, that's we're back to criminology with that. You know, who knows what the power relations are in the Kremlin, and in a way that's a speculation. But at least morally, I think it's good to have sanctions. So we've done at least some. I mean, the bizarre thing is now, of course, what you could argue that partly the war in eastern Ukraine is financed by euros, because the Russian budget is made up of to a large extent of exports of Russian raw materials to the European Union. 75% of the investment in the Russian economy comes from the European Union. So where does the money come from that Russia is using for doing all these things on Crimea and eastern Ukraine? Well, it comes from this dealings with the EU, and so at least we have some sanctions. And I'm not a specialist enough on sanctions and all of that to I mean, there's also an argument about the symbolic value of sanctions, you know, and I'm not sure that it's going to work, but at least there is some hope that in the long run, or maybe even in medium range perspective, you will have some group in Moscow emerging that will, you know, propose another policy.
That's all. We move on the list. Geir Flikke, in the back here.
Hello, my name is Geir Flikke. I'm with the University of Oslo. Hello, Andreas. Excellent speech, very stimulating. I find myself in agreement with your main points on the association agreement and the deep free trade agreement. And I don't think it has been highlighted that much that this was actually a comprehensive treaties that would change Ukraine in the long run. But my question is simply, after the parliamentary elections that were on Sunday and the results in the elections, do you think that the current new, so to say, Ukrainian elite will be able to understand the benefits of these agreements with the EU and to work to that end?
Yeah, I mean, I live in Kiev, and I think I would say yes. There is even a mystification of the EU. That is sort of this, that the EU and EU integration is a panacea for everything, sort of. And yeah, I mean, if I would just look on Ukrainian domestic politics, I would be actually, you know, that's something that a social scientist should never be, perhaps, but I would be optimistic. Because we have now a constellation after the disillusionment, after the Orange Revolution, that has been a very important historical learning process for Ukrainian civil society. You know, they had all these, you know, demonstrations and staying there in the freezing winter of 2004, fighting it out, nobody killed, you know, and then, you know, victory, and Yushchenko becomes president, and then the result of it was disaster. So, and I think that's now on the mind of everybody in Kiev. You know, this cannot happen anymore. So civil society is mobilized, and my impression is it will remain mobilized. The journalists are very alert. They're very skeptical. They don't believe anybody. They sort of, you know, I think the situation is now, you know, I mean, there's this mystification, but on the other side, there's also very little romanticism left. You know, that, and so and now you will have actually what for me the best result of these elections 2 days ago, yesterday, 2 days ago, is that on the lists of various party blocs, you have prominent civil society activists who have come into the parliament: Svetlana Zalishchuk, Hanna Hopko, Mustafa Nayem, Serhiy Leshchenko. These are all, I would say, they have a very good reputation, and I would very much respect them. And they are on different lists of different blocs. They've now come into parliament, but they had already before the elections an agreement that they would cooperate, that they would have a sort of interfaction group of these civil society activists, basically the people who organized the Euromaidan. And what I'm now hoping for is actually a change in Ukrainian parliamentarianism, that you would actually have now not just a new parliament in terms of the factions of which it consists and the ideological preferences, but also in terms of how it works. So I would be, you know, and I think, you know, the oligarchs will be still there, but they will have to fight a fight in the parliament, because I think these civil societies, they you know, they know exactly what's happening, and they are very skeptical, and they will not, you know, you cannot come with some sort of nice story to them and then tell them. They will be there, and they will look on what the parliament is doing, and they will ring the alarm bell early on. And the other factor is the association agreement, which is now at least partly ratified. So the EU is part of it already. So, and these are the mobilized civil society and the EU, I think, being part now of Russia, of Ukrainian domestic politics, change I think the domestic situation in Ukraine to a sufficient degree, I would say, to expect a rather successful new parliament, except for the factor of Russia. I think Russia probably knows these things, and they will try to interfere and to distract attention. And I think the biggest problem, by the way, of Ukraine is now investment and business climate, and the EU has to react to that, because I think the story behind what Putin is doing in eastern Ukraine is to create this perception of insecurity, instability in Ukraine, scare away investors. I'm just talking to German business people in Kiev, and they say, well, nothing is happening. The investors are going, no new investors coming, because they don't know what's happening. Because if they put money here, maybe tomorrow somebody from a People's Republic will come and expropriate them. Who knows? As it happened in eastern Ukraine. So and the EU has to do something here. George Soros has proposed to introduce a political insurance, like insuring investment. Germany did this as the Hermes coverage. If you know these things, that you have to compensate for the destabilization of the business and investment climate, and then the whole thing could work. But without it, if the Ukrainian state does not collect tax money, then the whole thing may as well collapse. I think the miscalculation, by the way, of Putin here is that he thinks he can play these games, and this is all about geopolitics and European values and so on. But if the Ukrainian state collapses, and I think that could be discussed because they have to collect taxes, and they cannot live on IMF money forever. So they have to. It has to become a sustainable system by itself. So if the Ukrainian state collapses, then the problem becomes simply geographical, because then you have 45 million people who are unhappy in Ukraine. Millions of them want to leave Ukraine, and there's no Mediterranean between the EU and Ukraine, and they will just go. And if you have like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who want to get over the border, and either the Polish-Ukrainian border, or they'll go to Belarus or through the Black Sea. I mean, how are you going to stop them? If the state collapses and you have suddenly potentially millions of Ukrainians who want to leave, who want to just go somewhere in Europe. Some will go to Russia, of course, but not many, I think. If you look at the opinion polls, not many people would go to Russia. And Russia, of course, if they would take them, but they want to go, they want to put them to Siberia or Norilsk or Kamchatka, Vladivostok. No, I mean that has happened already. People were put in planes in Rostov, and then they got out of a plane in Magadan and asked, "Where are we now?" These are welcome. That's Russia's vision of the whole thing. But I think what Putin is not understanding, that if the Ukrainian state collapses, it will touch upon core issues of European security, with these potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of refugees. That's not any longer about European values and geopolitics. That's now, and the EU cannot solve the issue. They cannot build a
I get the
wall.
impression that your optimism may be a bit measured after all.
Yeah.
So, but we move on our list. Henrik Seip, please.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning. Thank you for a very good speech, good thinking, good delivery. I'd like to begin with a very short aside. You said you can possibly picture seeing the 2018 World Cup in Russia. If time allows, you may want to explain why. I can certainly see it being played there with the FIFA leadership and their policies in mind. To more important business, you began by suggesting that Russia's real strategic challenges are maybe in random order: Islam, China, and modernization. And should we take it that picking a fight with their Slav brothers in Ukraine, or at least having this ongoing conflict with Ukraine, impedes Russia or even paralyzes it in its capacity to address its real challenges strategically. It's nice argument, but could you also please tell us why? Because I don't think it's obvious for us as an audience why exactly Russia should be less able to deal with these grand challenges because of the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
About the World Cup, I also have no illusions about FIFA, but I think the whole political situation, I think even the FIFA leadership will try to avoid scandals, and it would be a very politicized event. There would be many people who would, if it takes place in Russia, there would be so many people who would just make a fuss out of it that for FIFA it would be a very expensive thing. Maybe there would be then some compensation coming from Russia for this expenses, so to say, but I can't. That would be a big risk for FIFA, and I don't know what the situation will be in 2018. But of course, if Crimea is returned and the troops are out of eastern Ukraine, then of course, yeah, why not? But I don't think that will happen. Eastern Ukraine, maybe I'm slightly more hopeful that there might be a solution, but Crimea will not be returned, and then I can't imagine that happening. That would be, yeah. Let's see. And about the other issue, about solving these strategic issues for Russia. The West would be, for all three of them, the best partner, simply. Dealing with Islam, or radical Islam is here, obviously, not Islam, fundamentalism and terrorism, this is the issue, obviously, and not Islam as such. There's a commonality of interests. China, you could argue there is some commonality of interest, yeah, and there's all this talk of Putin about multipolarity, but the message might be that we are heading towards a bipolar world again. China versus the West, basically, and there's no Russia there. Russia could be either with the West or with China, but I think the preferable thing, even many Russians would acknowledge, would be Europe then, and then modernization. Obviously, the preferable partner is also the West, and then there is the issue you have to and one explanation for is that the Russian leadership is so patriotic about its Russian brothers on Crimea and eastern Ukraine that they disregard Russian national interests because they need to help the Russian brothers against the Kiev fascists and save them from genocide and all. This is one story, but I think that's not the story. I think it's all about this little system that they have created with the people, Rosneft and Gazprom and all these things and all the villas and the private jets and all. That's the story, actually, and that's why they disregard Russian national interests, not because they are Eurasianists or stuff like that. There are Eurasianists in Russia, and there are people there are fanatics, and in that way, the age of extremes is maybe not entirely over in Russia. There are lots of these people, and they believe in it. Dugin, even Zhirinovsky, I think, is a much less cynical person than I've met him, and I wrote a dissertation on him, and I think he is actually, he has these crazy ideas, and they are, and he's a clown, but he's also playing himself, and other people too, they actually believe these, but this is not the Kremlin leadership. These guys are actually sort of rationally thinking, but they are not Russian patriots, you could argue. That's the problem with them. In a way, you would argue there's not enough patriotism in Russia. That would be, in a way, the somewhat provocative thesis.
Okay, next to Henrik, can you introduce yourself, please? Next to Henrik, yeah.
Igor Kopsov. Just 2 points, not necessarily questions. You started your presentation where you defined the political interests or Russian interests Obviously, from your own point of view, I just want to remind you a Russian saying, what is a blessing to a Russian might be a trouble for a German. So it's very difficult for EU people to take ground and start preaching on definition of the Russian national interests. I think you should leave it to Russians. But the second point is, I find the whole premises of your presentation confusing. You are arguing about something, but I don't see a single contradiction in what you just said. There is no contradiction between having a civil war and the Russian influence or insurgents. It just happens. 3,000 Ukrainians were killed on both sides. It's not just because Russians came there and started fighting. So there is a little bit of everything. There is no contradiction between, you cannot split EU, NATO, Eurovision expansion, and Western national interest and ideology. It's one ball. That's what you are dealing with. You cannot split, oh, it's not NATO, it's EU. It's everything. And the same way in Russia, it's a little bit of the criminology, a little bit of the one Russia world, a little bit of everything. And that's what makes the situation different. But there is no analysis is misleading. You need to have a holistic approach to the situation, not to artificially split it into individual components, but to see it all in one global presence. So just 2 points which I noted when I was listening to you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, I mean, I agree actually to the extent with you that yes, there's a larger picture and there are many other factors playing in. But, you know, I mean, what's the purpose of our being here, you know, to talk about everything a little bit and, you know, I want to have a thesis and I want to defend it. It's in a way, it's an intellectual enterprise. And I mean, I had this argument on Ponars with Kudelia about the local grassroots of the Donbas insurgency, and I buy many of his arguments. But I mean, I think there should be many more civil. If you buy this whole argument, you have this sort of, you have local grievances, then you have a state that is not able to control, and you have these sort of regional divisions. There should be many more civil wars in the war, because you have that all across the world. I mean, if you would, there would be maybe some people in the European Union, if you would give them arms, and you would have, I mean, the point is here also that the Donbas is on the Russian border, and that these people can always run away. And some of them did actually. They went to Moscow. Yeah. So and there will be not. They can kill many people in eastern Ukraine, and in Russia they are fine. You know, and there will be even heroes there. You have already Berkut people who were sort of involved in the Kiev events, who then went to Russia and made a second career there. If you would provide this with separatists in the European Union, I could imagine that you find fanatics here in Spain or in Belgium or somewhere. You know, if you tell them, we give you money, we give you weapons, and if you don't want it anymore, you can come to us and you will be safe there. You know, you can create many civil wars. I mean, there's I think, and there was always this potential was always there. But as I said, there's no politics of the civil war. It's a political event that is not explained politically, and that's the biggest paradox.
Okay. Next, the last question from Ulf Sverdrup in the corner.
Thank you. My name is Ulf Sverdrup here at NUPI. Thank you so much for your presentation. You're arguing that the root cause of the conflict somehow is the threat of Europeanization of Ukraine. And you hinted to, or you said that the Russians saw this lately, but they were a bit surprised when it came. We can also add, I think, that Europeans were also surprised by the force of their own kind of activities. So two simple questions. The first is, if this is the root cause of the conflict, What kind of implication would that have for the end game? And the implication of what will we see unfolding the next few months, or what kind of stage are we entering into? So that's the first question. The second question is, the Ukrainians have obviously sacrificed a lot, and you pointed to the fact that they have high aspiration, and the European is a kind of the solution. European integration is the solution to many problems. But at the same time, I think Europeans themselves are maybe not ready to invest and to ensure the activities, and Europe is in a situation of deep economic difficulties, etc. How do you see this tension, kind of huge aspirations, hopes, and sometimes on the one side, and the other side, the limited willingness of Europe to kind of reach out and to invest, etc.?
I suppose it's very appropriate to end this session with a glimpse into the future.
Yeah, I mean, they are both rather complicated questions. Thank you for them. I've thought about them also, and I think the only implication I could see here of the policies, and we are back now to the sanctions issue, is I can only see that Russia will behave differently if the costs of the current behavior of Russia become so high that there is then a sort of balancing. Okay, Ukraine is Europeanizing. That is going to be a threat to us. But if we act against it, the threats will be even more immediate, quicker, and higher. I mean, you know, that's very, very simple, and maybe, but I don't see another. I don't, you know, with Crimea, before Crimea, there was always this issue, we all get on one table, and then we talk a little bit, and then we find a deal, and then maybe we'll create something from Lisbon till Vladivostok, or even from Vancouver till Vladivostok, and we have a whole new thing. But with Crimea, that's all over. I mean, it cannot be accepted, and Putin cannot track back, and there is a real deadlock here. And then it's only confrontation. It will be not military confrontation. And then you have to rise the costs of the economic confrontation to a degree where this becomes more costly than actually driving the Ukrainian state into collapse. Which I think would be sort of for the political system of Putin very, you know, if Ukraine collapses, then he could say, you know, listen, that, you know. You see what happens if you have a Euromaidan and the Orange Revolution, and if you sign an association agreement with Europe and flirt with NATO and so on, then your state collapses. So we don't want to have that in Russia. So let's build the Putin system. And then about the EU here, I think what I mentioned before is that the EU will have to see this as a security issue, because it's if the Ukrainian state collapses, then, you know, there are 45 million people, and I think that, and then this could then motivate much more engagement, because that would go beyond, you know, European values and the acquis communautaire and all these building the common European and all these things, because that will then touch core issues. If the Germans understand that we may have, you know, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians coming to Germany and looking for any job because there's hunger, or because they freeze in Ukraine, because they you know, then they will start, oh, okay, now we have to do something, yeah? And there are some things that could be easily done, like, I mean, there is this magical formula of the membership perspective. I actually do believe that this is that it could change something. I mean, in Ukraine, you could argue the membership perspective wouldn't change anymore that much, because you have already a very pro-European parliament already. You have already the support of your population. All the political elites are very pro-European. So there, the membership, and they actually want now to implement the association agreement even without the membership perspective, hoping that one day they will get then the membership perspective. And Poroshenko has said he wants to apply for EU membership in 2020. So that's already announced. But for international investors, it could be quite important if the European Council comes and says, once Ukraine fulfills the Copenhagen criteria, it can apply for membership. We will have membership negotiations, candidacy, all the usual process, and then at one day it will. And then the investors, you know, the big companies, they will think, okay, if Ukraine is member of the EU in 20 years, maybe we should get in there now. And that could then change the whole situation. And over the political insurance that Soros proposed, maybe it will not cost much, because you would have the insurance, which would then encourage investment, but the investment would then stabilize the situation and make the insurance less risky. You know, you have this sort of, you would have this positive spiral, and these are all things that the EU could do. The visa liberalization agreement, the quick ratification of the association agreement by all 28 member states, that doesn't cost that much. You know, these are all things that we're not talking about billions and billions of. You could do that, and it's just a matter of political will, and the will is not there because it's not yet perceived as a security problem. They still think about geopolitics and European values, and we against the, for human rights and all. But once it's understood that the collapse of the Ukrainian state will actually have major implications for the internal affairs of many European states, then I think we could see some change.
Well, great, thanks. It's been a fantastic session. Maybe we did not get the full answers to all the questions. The politics in Ukraine these days is very much a moving target, and maybe if we meet again 1 year from now, it will look different. But definitely, we have much more. Your analysis has enabled us to get a much better picture of what's going on, and we'll go back home and try to digest all this. So thank you very much for coming to us, Andreas. You're welcome home.